John Stuart Mill. Part 3. Considerations on Representative Government. For Mill, while government is something we must have, not any form of government will do. Mill robustly rules out the romantic idea that a despotic monarchy would be the best form of government, if only we could be sure to find a good despot. He writes, "I look upon this as a radical and most pernicious misconception of what good government is, which, until it can be got rid of, will fatally vitiate all our speculations on government." From his utilitarian perspective, Mill adopts the position that the function of government is twofold: the preservation of order and the attainment of some measure of social progress and human development. Of the two functions, Mill is inclined to rate the second higher than the first. In his book on representative government, written some 2 years after On Liberty, Mill charges government not only with the standard task of creating happiness, or at least the conditions for happiness, he also wants it to become responsible for encouraging the greatest degree of mental cultivation in its citizens. This is a very old idea, and one long thought dead, whose corpse is none the better for being dragged out of its grave. Libertarians might be able to live with a government that provided peace and justice and confined itself strictly to that task, but they can have no truck with a government that takes it upon itself to help its citizens to achieve mental cultivation. When Mill takes the function of government to be not just the provision of the conditions conducive to happiness, but also to encourage what one can only call the spiritual potential of his citizens, we see him returning from a purely utilitarian conception of government to one that is closely related to one common to the classical conceptions of Greece and Rome. While he acknowledges the bread and butter function of government, he writes, "The most important point of excellence which any form of government can possess is to promote the virtue and intelligence of the people themselves." And he continues, "We may consider then, as one criterion of the goodness of a government, the degree in which it tends to increase the sum of good qualities in the governed, collectively and individually. Since besides that their well-being is the sole object of government, their good qualities supply the moving force which works the machinery." In the bad old days, the struggle for liberty was between the people and its political rulers. Rulers then consisted of a governing one or a governing tribe or caste who derived their authority from inheritance or conquest, who, at all events, did not hold it at the pleasure of the governed. Nowadays, that is nowadays in the 19th century, things are or may be different. If our rulers can be in some way identified with us, then there is no possible tension between a them and an us. There is no principal obstacle to a government's having popular support, but only some forms of popular government are conducive to the active participation of citizens, something that is desirable in any society which has learned the virtue of obedience. Popular government also is broadly protective of the rights of individuals and conducive to their moral advancement. Echoing ideas that come to us from the Greeks, Mill says, "The ideally best form of government is that in which the sovereignty or supreme controlling power in the last resort is vested in the entire aggregate of the community. Every citizen not only having a voice in the exercise of that ultimate sovereignty, but being at least occasionally called upon to take an actual part in the government by the personal discharge of some public function, local or general." Genuine popular government, however, is possible only in very small states, a point with which Rousseau would be in firm agreement. On the other hand, the benefits of advanced civilization are only available in very large states. Is there some way to combine the benefits of popular government with the advanced civilization that comes with large size? Yes, says Mill. The answer lies in representative democracy. Much of the Considerations on Representative Government is devoted to developing the details of a scheme for representative government. It's not necessary to give or to grasp a blow-by-blow account of the details of Mill's scheme. It is sufficient to appreciate the broad moves he makes. Mill doesn't believe that just any form of government can be matched with just any form of society. Which form of government is best for a given society is related to that society's stage of development. He writes, "The proper functions of a government are not a fixed thing, but different in different states of society, much more extensive in a backward than in an advanced state. Civilization, he thinks, requires the sacrifice of certain elemental freedoms, while what he calls uncivilized races and the bravest and most energetic still more the rest are averse to continuous labour of an unexciting kind. What Mill calls real civilization requires the acceptance of the necessity of just such unexciting work, and the mind must be disciplined into the habits required by civilized society." One is reminded of the old joke, before the white man came to America, there were no taxes and the men hunted and fished all day. And this is an improvement. Is democracy the best form of popular government? Democracy has never been quite respectable as a political doctrine. After all, once the mob rules, who can tell what will happen? Mill is prey to conflicting tendencies. On the one hand, he is inclined to widen suffrage, but then the problem of mob rule rears its head. Should the people be given what they say they want, or what their betters know to be really good for them? His utilitarian upbringing inclined him to the former. His perfectionist tendencies inclined him to the latter. Democracy has dangers, one of which is the danger of class legislation, of government intended for, whether really affecting it or not, the immediate benefit of the dominant class, to the lasting detriment of the whole. If representative government is to work, the people as a whole must be prepared to receive it, to preserve it, and to shoulder the burdens which it imposes upon them. Mill, in a Platonic moment, believes that the core areas of government, legislative, judicial, and executive, require a level of competence beyond the capacity of the man in the street, and also beyond the capacity of his representatives. Such governmental competences belong only to the expert. It is not the function of the citizens' representatives to govern. Rather, it is their task to control the experts who carry out the actual government. Mill writes, "While it is essential to representative government that the practical supremacy in the state should reside in the representatives of the people, it is an open question what actual functions, what precise part in the machinery of government shall be directly and personally discharged by the representative body. There is a radical distinction between controlling the business of government and actually doing it. The same person or body may be able to control everything, but cannot possibly do everything, and in many cases its control over everything will be more perfect the less it personally attempts to do." In Mill's representative democracy, not only is it the case that the people do not rule themselves directly, they are not even ruled by their representatives. Rather, they are ruled by experts who are controlled or meant to be controlled, not always the same thing, by their representatives. Mill writes, "The proper office of a representative assembly is to watch and control the government, to throw the light of publicity on its acts, to compel a full exposition and justification of all of them which any one considers questionable, to censure them if found condemnable, and, if the men who compose the government abuse their trust or fulfil it in a manner which conflicts with the deliberative sense of the nation, to expel them from office, and either expressly or virtually to appoint their successors." If this sounds familiar, that's hardly surprising, since this is more or less the orthodox current understanding of how our representatives should function. Of course, because of what is known as the agent-principle problem, it is very far from how they actually do function, but this is just another example of the divergence of reality and ideality. As Mill himself admits, the natural tendency of representative government is towards collective mediocrity. The agent-principle problem is the problem of aligning the interests of those whom you commission to look after your interest with your interests. Who does not know of boards of directors, nominally the employees or delegates of the shareholder owners of corporations, who act in every respect as if the property they administer is in effect theirs? In Ireland, we have local governments with elected representatives, who are relatively powerless to control or direct the actions of the county manager, who is nominally their employee. We have university presidents who are in law the employees of boards of regents or governing authorities, but who effectively dominate such bodies. In Mill's system of representative democracy, the agent-principal problem is exacerbated. Their representatives are the agents of the people, and the experts are agents of the representatives. What chance would you give for either the wishes of the people or even the wishes of their representatives being attended to? The key to the justification and popular acceptance of modern democracy is the idea of representation. Those who are governed are thought to be governed by those who represent them, and thus, it is claimed, in being governed by those who represent them, they are in effect governing themselves. This gets over the fundamental problem of why, in any political structure, some people rule and others are ruled. If rulers and ruled are in effect one and the same, then the problem of justifying the rule by one person or group of people over other people disappears. The justification of political governance, then, rests upon democracy, and the justification of democracy, in turn, rests upon representation. If the bough of representation were to break, then down would come the cradle of democracy, baby and all. How then are we to conceive of political representation? Is a political representative an agent of those whom he represents, limited to the carrying out of their instructions? Mill rejects this idea, as Burke had previously rejected it. Or is the political representative a trustee, free to act in the interest of those whom he represents, according to his own best judgment of what those interests are? Or is he neither an agent, nor a delegate, nor a trustee, being simply able to do more or less whatever he likes once elected? Or are there other possibilities in addition to these? In what way are our political representatives representative? What does it mean for one man to represent another? Under normal circumstances, those who represent us do so at our bidding, and cease to do so at our bidding. They act on our instructions within the boundaries of a certain remit, and we are responsible for what they do as our agents. Furthermore, the central characteristic of representation by agency is that the agent is responsible to his principal and is bound to act in the principal's interest. Is this the situation with so-called political representatives? Political representatives are not, usually, legally answerable to those whom they allegedly represent. In fact, in modern democratic states, the majority of a representative's putative principles are in fact unknown to him. Can a political representative be the agent of a multitude? This also seems unlikely. What if the principals have interests that diverge from each other? A political representative must then, of necessity, cease to represent one or more of his principles. The best that can be done in these circumstances is for the politician to serve the many and betray the few. If it is to be tenable, representative or indirect democracy requires a clear, robust and defensible conception of representation. No such conception has been forthcoming, and it is doubtful if any ever will be forthcoming. It used to be said that only three things were definitely true of the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. Similarly, two things are definitely true of representative democracy. It isn't democracy, and it isn't representative. In the end, representation is a fig leaf that is insufficient to cover the naked and brutal fact that even in our sophisticated modern states, however elegant the rhetoric and however persuasive the propaganda, some rule and others are ruled. The only question is, as Humpty Dumpty noted in Through the Looking Glass, which is to be master? That's all. Is there not always a danger that a supposedly popular government will descend into factionalism? Yes. Mill is rightly suspicious of government by faction, however large that faction might be. If democracy means government of the whole by a majority which alone has representation, the ends of democracy are bound to be frustrated. For the minority, having no representatives, has no assurance that its rights will be protected, and the majority will be in a position to pursue its sinister interest. Mill fears, for example, that a representative body representing the interests of the working class will jeopardize the property rights of the wealthy, and thus undermine the economy of the nation. To ensure that everybody was in fact represented, Mill proposed a complex system of proportional representation. History has shown that Mill was right to fear government by faction. Practical politics in most democracies is a contest between various gangs fighting to determine which of them can get its hands on the tiller of the ship of state. History has also shown that Mill was wrong to think that his proportional representation system would solve his problems. This wasn't because there was some particular flaw with his system, but because there is a basic flaw with the whole notion of representation to begin with. So, is Mill a libertarian? No, Mill is not a libertarian. Mill's ideal of liberty, writes Paul Kelly, is far less libertarian than is often supposed, and as Joseph Hamburger has recently argued, it is deliberately designed to challenge the moral authority of Christianity. Liberty is not an overriding right, but merely an instrument of perfection. David Brink comments succinctly, Mill's liberalism should not be confused with traditional libertarianism, which does recognize a right to liberty per se. Liberty may be restricted not only if there is definite damage, but even the definite risk of damage. Such being the case, Mill writes, the case is taken out of the province of liberty and placed in that of morality or law. From a libertarian point of view, one of the most disturbing aspects of Mill's thought is the positive role he allocates to the government in educating the tastes and morals of his citizens. Even assuming that there is any role for government in the production of any kind of pleasure for anyone, there is a high quotient of "we know what's good for you" in the suggestion that a task of government is steering, that is coercing, citizens away from lower and towards higher pleasures. There is more than an echo in this suggestion of the German idealist conception of autonomy. True freedom, as distinct from the merely vulgar freedom which concerns itself with non-interference. And there is also an anticipation of the contempt for the pleasures of the plebeians and the bourgeoisie one finds in the adherents of the 20th century Frankfurt School. Mill accords a priority to the individual over society, a priority libertarians would happily endorse. But this priority is not so much a priority of the individual as he actually is in the raw, but of the educated and cultured individual he may become. Mill is prepared to argue that citizens of a representative government may be subject to positive obligations that restrict their freedoms, such as giving evidence in law cases, contributing to the common defence or other joint works necessary to the interests of society of which he enjoys the protection, and a certain level of good Samaritanism, such as saving the lives of others or protecting them against abuse. Intra-family relations should be subject to regulation. Especially, Mill thinks, there should be compulsory education of children. He writes, "Is it not almost a self-evident axiom that the state should require and compel the education, up to a certain standard, of every human being who is born its citizen?" Sometimes it is not immediately obvious whether these obligations are to be construed as moral or legal, and whether the compulsion to be applied to the recalcitrant is moral suasion or physical force. But I think the tendency of Mill's thought here inclines towards legal compulsion. Later in the book, another passage of Mill gives weight to this interpretation. He writes there, "Though society is not founded on a contract, every one who receives the protection of society owes a return for the benefit. This return includes not injuring the interests of others, which can be conceived of as rights, and secondly, in each person's bearing his share of the labours and sacrifices incurred for defending the society or its members from injury and molestation. These conditions society is justified in enforcing at all costs to those who endeavour to withhold fulfilment." The thinking of earlier utilitarians, Bentham included, was that laws were, at best, necessary evils and should be as limited and as restricted as possible. This was not Mill's view. He was willing to have extensive systems of laws, provided they were productive of what he saw as the human good. In economics, Mill was no supporter of laissez-faire. He endorsed widespread regulation of business and industry. the significant feature of Mill's economics was that he substantially abandoned the conception of natural economic laws and, in consequence, the dogma of a self-regulating competitive economic system, writes Sabine. This abandonment of laissez-faire was just one dimension of a commitment to what would later come to be called a doctrine of positive freedom. In his Principles of Political Economy, Mill devotes an entire section to what he regards as the necessary and multifarious functions of government. Mill considers what is, in effect, the classical liberal position and rejects it. He writes, "We sometimes hear it said that governments ought to confine themselves to affording protection against force and fraud. That these two things apart, people should be free agents, able to take care of themselves, and that so long as a person practices no violence or deception to the injury of others in person or property, legislators and governments are in no way called on to concern themselves about him." Against this position, Mill raises the objection that nothing except expediency allocates a government to one set of functions and not others, so that if a government is considered necessary for law, justice and security functions, there can be no principal objection to its taking responsibility for other functions as well. Libertarian anarchists would accept the principle underlying Mill's objection. That indeed is the substance of their objections to minarchism. Of course, libertarian anarchists run the argument in the opposite direction, arguing that if government is not necessary for health or welfare or education or the economy, there is no principal reason why it should be regarded as necessary for justice and security either. The whole of Book 5, Chapter 11 of the Principle of Political Economy is devoted to the topic of the grounds and limits of the laissez-faire or non-interference principle. Mill is well aware of the objections to government intervention, its compulsory character, the necessity for taxation to fund its interventions, the increase in power and influence accruing to governments resulting from their interventions, the relative incompetence of government agents, the depressing effect of government intervention on individual and collective action. But he nevertheless sees a role for government in the establishment of minimum wages, the regulation of working hours, the provision of public assistance, the prohibition of selling oneself into slavery, and certain forms of censorship. It used to be believed that the government had a role in fixing prices and regulating manufacturing, but Mill thinks that the benefits of free trade in relation to price and quality are now wisely recognized. However, Mill believes that individual liberty is not involved in the doctrine of free trade, so that regulations pertaining to adulteration or sanitary arrangements or dangerous working conditions do not constitute a violation of the principle of liberty. I can see no obvious reason why Mill wants to, or indeed can make a distinction in kind between individual freedom and free trade. Free trade is, in the end, simply the exercise of individual freedom with respect to buying and selling. Clearly, there are moral considerations that bear upon this form of social interaction, but such moral considerations bear on all forms of social interaction. Trade will also have to operate under legal constraints that prohibit adulteration, deception, and so on, but libertarians would view such practices as violations of the non-aggression principle, and so their prohibition would not be a restriction of liberty. From all this, it can plainly be seen that Mill is recommending policies that are based not only on the harm principle upon liberty, but on a more positive principle, which we might call the help principle. Consider again Mill's endorsement of Good Samaritan laws. If I decline to rescue someone who is drowning, it is clear that they will suffer harm. But it is not at all clear that I am in any way responsible for that harm unless we stipulate a pre-existent obligation to help others, which my inaction violates. But if such an obligation to help others exists, how can it be confined within manageable limits, such that every person's liberty is not severely constrained? Mill's on liberty, then, should, in the interest of truth in advertising, perhaps be retitled On Certain Kinds of Limited and Restricted Liberty. Summary. Mill's writings have had an enormous effect on modern social and political thought. Mill's essay on liberty can give the impression that Mill is a doughty defender of the freedom of the individual against the combined forces of society and state. That opinion is not entirely wrong, although it is not entirely right either. Ayn Rand describes On Liberty as the most pernicious piece of collectivism ever adopted by suicidal defenders of liberty. In On Liberty, Mill states one very simple principle which should govern the dealings of society with the individual. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. On closer inspection, this principle turns out to be neither one, simple, and perhaps not even a principle. Mill lists 4 grounds on which both freedom of opinion and freedom of expression of opinion can be shown to be necessary to the well-being of mankind. 1. The silenced opinion may be true. 2. It may contain a portion of truth even if it is not completely true. 3. A received opinion which is wholly true, if it cannot be challenged, will be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. And 4. Such an opinion, if not subject to challenge, will be in danger of collapsing into a formal and inefficacious dogma. Mill believes that the human good lies in a kind of deliberative choosing, which gives direction to one's life. If choice is to be genuine and informed, then not only must we have liberty of opinion and expression of opinion, we must also, within certain limitations, have liberty of action. One could make a case for the legal restriction of individual liberty on a number of grounds. Paternalism, moralism, offence prevention, or harm prevention. Mill rejects moralism, offence prevention completely, paternalism partially, and endorses only harm prevention completely. Despite his professed allegiance to utilitarianism, Mill's most significant contribution to social and political thought was his On Liberty, the arguments of which are not always obviously in accord with that doctrine. If Mill had been a consistent utilitarian, then liberty would have had only an instrumental value, inasmuch as it was a means to man's overall happiness. For him, liberty of thought and speech and action was a good whether or not it made a contribution to happiness, although he did, in fact, think that liberty was and would be happiness-producing. Mill's strategy in On Liberty is not to carve out a space for liberty against government intrusion. Rather, it is intended to address the dangers to liberty presented by society. One of the chapters in Liberty is called Of the Limits to the Authority of Society over the Individual. There is no corresponding chapter entitled Of the Limits to the Authority of the State over the Individual. For Mill, while government is something we must have, not any form of government will do. From his utilitarian perspective, Mill adopts the position that the function of government is twofold: the preservation of order and the attainment of some measure of social progress and human development. Of the two functions, Mill is inclined to rate the second higher than the first. Civilization, he thinks, requires the sacrifice of certain elemental freedoms. The core areas of government, legislative, judicial, and executive, require a level of competence beyond the capacity of the man in the street and also beyond the capacity of his representatives. Such governmental competences belong only to the expert. Mill is rightly suspicious of government by faction, however large that faction might be. Is Mill a libertarian? No. Mill is prepared to argue that citizens of a representative government may be subject to positive obligations that restrict their freedoms. In economics, Mill was no supporter of laissez-faire. He endorsed widespread regulation of business and industry.